Hi there, today we're going to take a look at another developer who produced a number of games for Mastertronic, especially during their early era. We're going to take a look at the Darling brothers, David and Richard. Their career in programming started in the early 80s. In 1982 they formed their own company called Galactic Software, released several games for the VIC-20 and also for the Commodore 64. And in 1983-84 sort of time they developed their own sort of programming tool which they called Games Creator, and that allowed them to make pretty simplistic games, single screen games with a sort of library of graphics and audio and presentation. This allowed them to churn out games pretty quickly. They actually released that as a product in this country. That was published by Mirrorsoft. There's a copy of it there. And it was also released by Mastertronic in America on disc, and later released by the Darling brothers again by Codemasters under the name Creations. With Games Creator they produced a number of games on their own label called ACE, Advanced Computer Entertainment. Some of those games were later re-released by Mastertronic, and eventually they struck a deal to have their games published by Mastertronic. When Mastertronic launched their products in 1984, from the original 13 games released, 7 of those games were Darling brothers productions, all created with the Games Creator. So we're going to start by taking a look at those 7 games in catalogue number order. The first of those was Spacewalk. There was actually 2 versions of this published, and the one you're seeing on screen right now was the re-release, or the second version of it. The first one was very bland, very basic graphics and sound, very simplistic gameplay, and quite challenging because it was very easy to lose lives from the second level onwards. The second version that you're looking at improved the graphics and sound. The backgrounds look nicer, the foreground sprites are nicer, it's got background music which the original release didn't have. The gameplay is pretty much the same, which is you've got to get a satellite before it hits the ground and return it to the space shuttle, but it's more balanced. The enemies are better, and the AI on the enemies is slightly better in that they don't just crash straight into you and kill you off almost straight away. It is still a challenging game. It's not too bad for the first offering from the Darling brothers on Mastertronic, but once you've played it for sort of 10 or 15 minutes you've probably seen enough. The second release was BMX Racers. This was actually the top selling Darling brothers Mastertronic game with over 125,000 copies sold for the Commodore 64. It's a pretty basic sort of BMX racing game. You ride down a course avoiding trees and rocks and going over bridges. It's basically just avoid the obstacles game. The graphics are pretty nice, the music's pretty bland, as it is with all the Games Creator games, very repetitive. Basically it's a memory test for all intents and purposes. One hit and you're dead, so it's basically just last as long as you can, not crash into anything. It's a pretty nicely presented game, and I can see why it sold a lot of copies. Obviously BMXs were very popular in 1984, so not a surprise that it was a big selling game, and it's certainly playable and offers a challenge. But again, once you've played it for 10 or 15 minutes you've probably seen enough. There are only 5 stages in it. The next release of that first 7 games was Jungle Story, which based on the instructions is loosely based on the Jungle Book. It does mention Mowgli in the instructions. This game is awful, it's a terrible game. It's got this awful sort of faux scrolling effect where the background moves behind you, but you can still move backwards and forwards. You don't actually make the background scroll. Virtually everything in the game kills you. The only thing that doesn't kill you, and does kill you if it runs into you, but the only thing that can be shot is a cheetah or leopard. I'm not quite sure what it's supposed to be, but that's the only thing in the whole game you can shoot. You'll basically see all the game's got to offer in about 20 seconds because all it does is repeat the same things coming at you over and over again, the same background. It's incredibly boring, not really any kind of great challenge. It's also got this weird sort of reverse countdown scoring mechanism where the score starts at a certain value and counts downwards, and the only way you can top it up is by shooting that big cat. So it's a bit of a strange way of giving you a score. I'm not quite sure how you chase a high score really in that game. Next up was Orbitron. This is a very unimaginative space shooter. It's just a single screen shooter, not really anything going on there, no enemy formations, just random sprites moving down the screen and shooting at you. It's got a bit of a high score challenge, but it's really boring, and again you'll have seen all you're going to see of the game in about 20 seconds or so, unless you get to a later level where the sprites change, but basically it just continues ad infinitum with the same sort of boring gameplay. The next game from that original 7 was Bionic Granny. This is considered to be one of the worst Commodore 64 games ever released. It's got quite an original plot at least. You're an old lady who's basically trying to hit kids as they come out of school. It's really simplistic single screen gameplay. You just got the basic graphics of the school, the kids coming out of it, and a lollipop lady who throws a lollipop stick at you periodically. All you do is move left and right and just try and hit the kids as they come down the paths. To be honest, although it's rated as one of the worst Commodore 64 games ever released, it's not actually as bad as Jungle Story or Orbitron or some of the other Games Creator games released later on. It's not really worth the $1.99, but it does offer some kind of a high score challenge at least. The next game is Sub Hunt, loosely based on Sequest for the Atari 2600. And basically you just scroll along in a submarine shooting giant fish, rescuing divers and avoiding bombs from the bomber that flies overhead. It's got quite nice graphics, this one, better than some of the other games so far, and smooth scrolling effects. It's simplistic and repetitive like all the other Games Creator games, but probably worth playing for a high score challenge. The only real issue with that one is that the difficulty level doesn't seem to get any more difficult as the game progresses. It basically stays the same, so you could play forever realistically. It's got a little kind of risk-reward mechanism as well when you're trying to capture the diver and avoid getting hit by the fish. And the last of those 7 releases was Pigs in Space. This had actually already been released by the Darling Brothers on their Ace software packaging. It's a clone of the arcade game Pooyan, missing some of the more clever gameplay aspects of that game, but it does add a unique section where you have to rescue the stolen piglet to complete each level, so that's quite a nice addition to the game. It's certainly the best of the first wave of 7 releases. It's playable, enjoyable, it's got a good high score challenge, and if you're a fan of Pooyan, it's a reasonable enough substitute for that. It did sell a lot less copies compared to all the other Mastertronic games, and I believe that's because it may have been recalled due to copyright issues with Pooyan and also using Pigs in Space, which may have been copyrighted by Jim Henson and his Muppet characters. As you'll have seen, all these Games Creator games have a very similar layout to them. The screens are laid out the same, they've got very similar graphics, music, all pretty basic stuff produced by that Games Creator product. They also have something else in common, which is in the middle of loading the game, the loading actually stops for this 2-screen instruction text. Really annoying. I can imagine back in the day if you were loading a game and someone did take quite a long time to load and you had to go off and, I don't know, have your tea or something like that, and then you came back and it hadn't loaded the game, it just loaded this instruction screen in, which had usually quite bad spelling or bad grammar, typical of the guys at that point, the Darling Brothers being sort of late teens. I can imagine it was a pretty annoying sort of scenario, and it's certainly very annoying for me when I'm loading the games and I just leave them to load and go off and do something else and then come back and find these annoying screens just showing. I suppose it was a nice idea for sharing the instructions, but as I say, pretty annoying stuff. So later in 1984, another batch of Darling Brothers games was released. Again, all but one of these was done by the Games Creator, and the first of those was Dark Star. This was a re-release of a game that they'd already released on Ace software, as were most of this second wave, so effectively they're just putting out the same stuff that they'd already done once, probably to try and make a bit more money with the Mastertronic distribution. So Dark Star, quite obviously influenced by Star Wars. You've got to fly down the tunnel, avoiding things shooting at you and flying at you, trying to get to the end of the tunnel and basically complete the game. It's effectively BMX racers in space with added shoot 'em up elements. The first priority is to make it through the tunnels, and then you can shoot things for extra points. And it even has the same music, albeit played at a different tempo. That's something that becomes apparent with these Games Creator games, as they just reuse the music from one game to the next. In this game you only get one life, and it's also very unfair because you have to choose a tunnel at the branches periodically without knowing if it'll lead to a dead end. So it's effectively just a memory test. Once you've worked out which of the branches to take each time, you can actually complete the entire game in about 5 minutes. So it's not really got a lot of replay or longevity. It's just a really dull space-based memory test game, really annoying and just not a great lot of fun to play. Next up we have Magic Carpet, which I think has already been released by Advanced Computer Entertainment. It's a single screen maze game where you have to avoid the obstacles to get to the end of each screen. There's only 3 screens though, 3 levels effectively, and you need pixel perfect timing and a bit of luck as well, especially on the second screen where you've got this lift section where you've got to move up the screen between two bars. If either the bars hit you, you lose a life, and that's basically you just push up and hope for the best that you sit between the two bars. It's infuriatingly difficult. First level not too bad, but the second and third are almost impossible. The graphics are quite nicely drawn, and the sound and music pretty awful, as is typical of these games. This is another one with this weird reverse countdown scoring system. In this game, you'd actually get a higher score for just running into one of the boulders right at the beginning of the first level 3 times than you would trying to get through the first screen. Next up is Challenger, which is effectively just an enhanced variation of the classic Bomb the City game that appeared on most early home computers. You scroll across the screen, gradually getting closer to the ground. You have to bomb the city before you hit the skyscrapers. It's got scrolling, which earlier versions of the game wouldn't have had. It's got different cities to bomb, and it's also got enemies attacking you from ground level with missiles. It's quite a simplistic game. It's challenging and pretty much unfair, to be honest, because as you get close to the ground it's almost impossible to avoid the missiles being fired at you from the ground. And the cityscape also regenerates after losing a life, making progression pretty difficult in this one. It's not the worst game, but it soon gets boring. You can say that for a lot of these releases, in all honesty. Following that, there was another Ace re-release. This one was Mind Control. Probably one of the best plots and most varied games from this game's creator era, consisting of 2 sections. There's a basic platform style game to get to the enemy Zyko's brain, and you get miniaturized at the end of that stage, which is quite a nice little animation. And then the second part of the game is a maze game where you're moving around his brain to try and eliminate something in the middle of his brain. Got quite nice graphics and animation, especially in the miniaturization stage, as I mentioned. It's a good challenge and some welcome variety in gameplay, more so than any of the other Darling Brothers games up to this point. The first stage can be pretty frustrating. Some pixel perfect jumping is required, and it does get tricky overall the game from about level 3 onwards, but all in all, one of the better offerings so far. And the last of the games released in that second batch in July 1984 is the only game not to be created by the game's creator up to that point. This is Chiller, loosely based on the Michael Jackson music video Thriller. It's a single screen platformer where you have to collect the crosses on each screen. There's multiple screens, starting with a forest, then moving on to a cinema and a ghetto of some description, for want of a better word. And this is the first Darling Brothers game that features an energy bar instead of lives, and which can be replenished by picking up mushrooms on various stages, so that's a good thing. It makes it a little bit less challenging because you've got a chance to boost your energy. The graphics and sound are much improved over the earlier games. The music's pretty decent and the graphics are a lot nicer. It's challenging, but with a more balanced difficulty level. It definitely shows an improvement in their programming from those earlier games creator games, and it's one of the few games up to that point that's probably worth the $1.99 asking price. A year later, in July 1985, there was another release programmed by the Darling Brothers. This is BMX Trials. This has actually already been released by Jetsoft as BMX Stunts a year earlier, so I guess Mastertronic just thought they could make some more money out of it. Obviously BMX is still being all the rage. The graphics and audio are decent enough, but the game's actually borderline impossible. It's a track and field game effectively, but using BMXs instead of just the usual running. You have to use the fire button to control pedalling, and you hammer the fire button. It means it's really difficult to maintain a constant speed, and incredibly tight qualifying times on most of the stages mean you'll probably never see the second stage unless you actually use an auto fire joystick and just hold the fire button down to get that sort of repetitive motion of a fire button. The first stage also has hazards, like things on the road that you can fall over, and basically that causes an immediate game over if you hit them. The second stage is pulling wheelies, and it's quite tricky to pull a wheelie at the right time, but if you use the auto fire you can actually cheat on this stage and wheelie for as long as you like, and that causes the distance counter in the game to break and award thousands and thousands of bonus points. The third event is relatively easy. It's just a jump as high and as far as you can, but then you get to the fourth stage, which is the slalom, and that's basically impossible with or without auto fire as far as I can tell, because you get time penalties for missing gates, and it's almost impossible to get from one gate to the other without missing some of them. Basically the game's got a nice idea. The idea of a track and field game using BMX is quite a good idea, and definitely one of the best ideas they came up with, but it's just completely ruined by poor controls and just ridiculous difficulty level. In October 1985, Mastertronic used two Darling Brothers games to launch their Mastertronic Added Dimension, or MAD label. This was a $2.99 price point, so they were looking for some high quality games to actually launch that new price level. And the two games in question were actually the last two games developed by the Darling Brothers for Mastertronic before they went off to form Codemasters. The first of those two games was The Last V8. This was programmed just by David Darling alone. It's got really nice graphics and presentation and audio with speech and a Rob Hubbard background tune, but it's barely a game. It's effectively more like a tech demo with only 2 levels. It's got really unintuitive controls for controlling the movement of the car. Basically, you've got to get the car to somewhere in less than 5 minutes, I believe, to actually complete the game. Contact with virtually anything kills you. There's also a very strict time limit with the car exploding if you don't reach the certain checkpoints at the right time. It's basically all style and no substance. As I say, it looks great, sounds great, but as a game it's pretty bloody awful, to be honest. Definitely not worth the $2.99. And while David was developing that, Richard Darling was developing Master of Magic, which is the complete opposite to The Last V8. It's pretty simplistically presented, not great graphics, but it's really great gameplay experience. It's a role-playing game, roguelike sort of dungeon maze exploring type game. Nice, easy and intuitive joystick only controls. Pretty decent graphic representation of the cave system and the enemies and objects, although the graphics aren't spectacular. It's got an awesome Rob Hubbard tune which featured in my top 15 tunes recently, and it's easily the best Darling Brothers game for Mastertronic from the whole of their products that they produced for the company. Before they went off to form Codemasters, there was one last piece of work done for Mastertronic by Richard Darling. He did the conversion of Spellbound, which originated on the Spectrum program by David Jones. It was converted to the Commodore 64 by Richard, and it's pretty much a like-for-like copy. There's not any obvious graphic improvements, but it does have another great Rob Hubbard tune in the background, which makes it worth checking out if you like those kind of games. So that was it in terms of contribution to Mastertronic's success from the Darling Brothers. They then went on to form Codemasters, founded by themselves and their father Jim. They pretty much copied the business model of Mastertronic. They published other developers' games as well as doing some work themselves. The two brothers moved mainly into sort of producer and designer role. They didn't actually do a lot more programming. There was one notable programming job done by Richard Darling, which was the BMX simulator, one of the early Codemasters games and one of the most popular ones, continuing their interest in the BMX bike and overhead view racing games. And later on, another famous game that continued that interest in cars and overhead view, in which David Darling was particularly involved, was Micro Machines, which was published for the Mega Drive, SNES, NES and various other platforms throughout the years. The two brothers sold their stake in Codemasters in 2007, and in 2008 they were awarded CBEs for their services to the British computer games industry. Not much happened for a few years after that, until in 2011 David Darling actually returned to the games industry with mobile developer Quali, who've put out several games on the iPhone and Android platforms. So in terms of their legacy and their contribution to Mastertronic, what can you say about the Darling Brothers? Well, they produced a lot of games, a lot of really terrible games, a couple of reasonably decent games, a few interesting ideas that they carried on later into their career. They did sell over nearly 800,000 games for Mastertronic, which would have got a retail value of over £1.7 million in the mid-80s, and royalties for them were probably something in the region of £250,000, which for two sort of 19, 20-year-olds when they finished their time at Mastertronic would have been a pretty good haul of money, I would think, especially considering most of the games were pretty terrible. So all in all, compared to Mr. Chip Software, they don't have a legacy of great games for Mastertronic, but there's no doubting that they did contribute to the success of the company in its early years.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
2, 1, 0.